Hello and welcome to Color with Kendi. In today's video, I'm going to walk you through the Amazing Gouache Brush Set for Procreate. I want to talk you through every single brush, and this video is for anyone who has purchased the set or is interested in getting it and wants to know how to use the brushes. But sometimes you buy brushes and you have no idea how to get the most out of them. I'm here to help, and we're going to walk through every single brush in this series. If you haven't yet purchased the pack and you want to find out more, you can find a link in the description as well as a pinned comment. Okay, let's begin. So when you download the brush set, you get a bunch of different files which you can import into Procreate. You get a brush set file, a reference PDF, an 8x10" canvas which already has a paper texture in it, as well as a 4800 by 6000 pixel canvas. So this is a larger canvas that also has a paper texture, and a brush tutorial canvas where we will be walking through all the brushes. So I would suggest you open this canvas and you can test out the brushes with me. We have a lot to cover and I can't possibly cover it in one video, so we're going to do two videos. Today is part one. So for part one, we are going to cover the Dilute background wash all the way to the soft edge brushes. And in part two, we'll cover the remaining brushes in this set as well as the paper texture. If you'd like to skip around, there are a few chapters and timestamps available in the description and the pinned comment. Now, before we begin, one thing I wanted to say is whenever I test brushes, I like to test them with a darker color. The reason for this, a darker color really shows the difference between the brushes a lot more than a pale color. So if you're really trying to figure out what's the difference between each brush, just use a darker color. It does not need to be black, but just something that has a darker value. You'll be able to see a lot more of the texture that way. Okay, so go into the layers panel and we're going to start here, the Dilute wet brushes, and make sure the paper background is turned on. And there's a paper overlay that's also turned on. Everything else should be turned off. So we're on Dilute wet brushes, and we're gonna start out with the Dilute background wash. Pick any color that you like. It could also be black, but I'm going to pick, let's say, a blue. Not quite a pale blue, but not really dark, somewhere kind of in between. So that's what I'm going to pick. Pick any color that you like. And let's make sure that we're on the right brush, the Dilute background wash. And let's zoom in. And I'm using the preset size here. So this is where we have the size and the opacity is right here. Now you can change the size as you want, or you could use the preset size. These are the sizes I typically use these brushes at the most, but that doesn't mean you have to use the size. It's just an easy way. Just tap and then you'll get to that size. But you can always change it to your liking. So this is 55%. So with this brush, if you use light pressure, you'll get something like that. But if you use heavy pressure, it will lay down a lot more pigment and it won't be as transparent. And for the best effect, what I like to do is without lifting the pencil, start out with light pressure and then build up pressure in areas where you want a little bit more color. So that way you can control how light or dark the color is. And if you zoom in, what you'll see is a variety of textures inside. I would generally use this brush for a background and for large areas. It's not as great for smaller areas. It can do the job, but it can't get too small. So I would suggest keep it at a larger size. And one thing to keep in mind is that if you lay down some color, lift your pencil, and lay down more color, you will see this overlap. So if you don't want that overlap, because this is a transparent brush, you see overlap. If you don't want the overlap, don't lift your pencil when you lay down the color, or you can always smudge that out if you'd like. Okay, so now let's move on to Brushy wet paint. It's this brush right here, and I'm going to use exactly the same color. And I'm going to use this preset size. So this, if I tap, is 35%. So let's zoom in here. So with light pressure, I'm getting something like that. You see a lot of the brush texture. And with heavy pressure, you don't see as much of the brush texture. Now, if I go to a larger size and I use light pressure, it looks like that. And if I use heavy pressure, you hardly see any of that brush texture. So with this brush, you will get a different effect depending on how much pressure you apply and also the size. This is one of my favorite brushes in this set, and if you've never used a dual color brush, let me explain how to use it. So let's go to the brush library, tap on dual color wet and dry, and you'll quickly understand why it's wet and dry. It's because if you look inside, it looks wet, but the edges look a bit dry. And when you have a dual color brush, you can select any two colors that you like, ideally colors that work well together. And to do that, to select the colors, is tap on the color menu. And I'm in disc mode, and you'll see two colors right here. So our first color here is the color that we've been using so far. And the second color right here, you can tap on it, and you can change it to anything you want. This is where you can change the hue. You can change the saturation and brightness. So I'm going to make it a red, but kind of like a pinky red. And I think that's a nice color. And what you'll see is because we've tapped on this color, this here has now become our main color. If you want the other color to be your main color, which you see more of, just tap back on it, and that will become your main color. So basically make sure that whenever you use a dual color brush, select two colors of your choice and tap on the color that you want to become your main color, and you will see it right there. Okay, so I'm using the mid-size for this, which is 25%, and let's talk about this brush. So when you apply light pressure, it looks like this. So you can tell it's a brush where you can see a lot of the paper underneath. So it's as though you've put a very old brush in some wet paint and then put it on your paper. You'll be able to see some of the paper texture underneath. Now, if you apply more pressure, you get a slightly different effect. And when you apply more pressure, you will start to see some of this second color. When you apply less pressure, you'll see more of that first color. Now, it is definitely a brush that is size dependent. So at a larger size, it's going to be a slightly different look. So at a larger size, light pressure. Now, if I go to heavy pressure, I'll see more of that second color. And you can create a variety of looks with this. Now with this brush, because it is a transparent brush, if you lift your pencil and add more pigment, you will see that overlap. Again, if you don't want that overlap, don't lift your pencil, completely fill in a shape without lifting the pencil, or you can always smudge that out. So now let's move on to the next layer. So let's go to the layers panel, turn this off, tap on Basic Gouache and turn that on. Okay, so let's talk about Basic Gouache A, B, and C. Whenever you see brushes where there's an A, B, and C, that basically means the brushes are actually quite similar to each other, but the texture is slightly different. And that's why it's A, B, and C. All of these brushes behave in similar ways, but there is a slight difference, and you really see those differences the most at different pressure points. So let's tap on Basic Gouache A, and you can pick any color that you like. I think for this, I'm going to go with maybe a pink, not too dark, not too light, somewhere in between. And I'm using the preset size, the larger one, which is 35, and I'm going to zoom in. So at light pressure, you get something like this. So you see some brush marks. If you really want to see those brush marks and you want to see some of the paper coming through, use light pressure. It's a very light hand, very, very light. And if you use heavy pressure, it looks very different. So it is very much a pressure dependent brush. You can get a variety of textures just from changing the pressure. And something to keep in mind is that when you lift your pencil and add more pigment with this one, you have a very, very slight overlap. I don't even know if you can see this on the screen. Do you see that? Very slight overlap. So that's kind of what you would see when you paint with traditional paints, is that if you lay down some pigment and let it dry a little bit, and you put some more pigment on top, there is that slight overlap because gouache can be slightly transparent depending on how much water you use. So that's basic gouache A. And if you go with a smaller size, it's a slightly different look, but same concept. At light pressure, you will get something like that. At heavy pressure, it will look like that. Now let's move on to basic gouache B, same color. Let's tap on the brush library and tap on basic gouache B. I'm going to use the mid size, which is size 35. Zoom in, and same concept. Light pressure, heavy pressure. And if you use it at a larger size, you will get something a little bit different. Do you see light pressure, heavy pressure? Slightly different look. And when you lift your pencil and add more pigment, you will see that slight overlap. It's not too much of an overlap, but enough to suggest that the paint had dried and then you would added more paint to it. And what I really like to do when using this kind of brush, I'm going to go to this size again, is to vary the pressure while you fill a shape. So let's say I have a circle and I vary the pressure. So you can create some interesting texture within that circle. If I did not vary the pressure, I'm going to undo with 2 fingers. If I didn't vary the pressure and just use the same pressure throughout, I get a very flat shape, but this shape still has some texture on the outside. But really the beauty of these brushes is when you vary the pressure. So this is light pressure, and then I'm going a little heavy. And then you can create an interesting look. And if you lift your pencil and then lay down more pigment, it creates a different look. Do you see? It has some nice texture in it. So if you want that texture, remember to vary the pressure and sometimes lift the pencil and lay down more pigment. You'll get a very interesting result this way versus a completely flat result. Okay, now basic gouache C. So I think you get the gist of how these brushes work. As I said, they're similar, but slightly different. You see, these are quite similar, but just slightly different textures, especially when you use lighter pressure. So for basic gouache C, I'm going to use the mid-size first. I'm going to zoom in here. Do you see that texture is quite different from the first two? So that's at light pressure. This is heavy pressure. I'm going to show you at a larger size. Light pressure, heavy pressure. And this one, you see a lot more of that overlap. Do you see there's that overlap? With this one, you see more overlap compared to the other two. This is basically thicker than these. So if you were to paint with gouache, you can adjust the thickness depending on how much water you add. So I would say that this is more watery than this one. So that's essentially the difference. And with this brush, I would also suggest that when you fill in a shape, vary the pressure and sometimes lift your pencil and apply more pigment, and you can create more of a messy look that way as well. So that is it for the basic gouache brushes. And now let's move on to the next layer. Tap on the layers panel, undo this, tap on more gouache brushes and turn that layer on. So now we have a dual color gouache and an opaque gouache. So let's talk about the dual color brush. Much like the other dual color brush, we have to select 2 colors. So let's select the brush first. It's this one. This is actually my favorite brush because I love the variety of textures and colors you can get when you change up the colors. I'll show you. So let's go in and let's keep this color the same. Tap on the second color, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it quite close to white. Not quite white, but very close to white. And then I'm going to tap on this again so that becomes my main color. Okay, let's zoom in. I am at the second preset size, which is 55. And at light pressure, that's the look you get. So at light pressure, I am seeing more of this color. I'm not really seeing that much of the white, but as you add more pressure, do you see? I'm seeing more of the white, but I'm not seeing it on its own. It's mixing in these two. Now, I touched this so it became my main color. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. It's going to look a bit different. So because this is now my main color, when I use light pressure, I'm seeing more of this. But now if I use heavier pressure, I'm seeing more of this second color, but mixed in with that first color. So you can create really interesting looks with this. So I'm going to show you with some other colors, because right now we just have a color mixed with white, but let me show you with something else. So let's change this white to, let's see, maybe an orangey color. So it's an orange and the magenta, and I'm going to keep this as my main color. So at light pressure, I am seeing more of the orange. I'm seeing hardly any of the magenta. And now as I increase my pressure, I'm seeing more of that magenta mixing in with this. So to use this brush, I think you need to experiment a little bit with the shades that you use here and see what result you like. It's actually a really fun brush to use. The thing to keep in mind is that the colors do vary depending on how much pressure you apply, and also the size of the brush can make things look a little bit different as well. And when you're filling in a shape, you can lift your pencil and add more color and add more pressure, and you can get an interesting look that way. So you've got something that doesn't look flat, it's got a variation of color. So really experiment with the colors that you choose and experiment with the pressure as well as the size. All right, so now I'm going to go to the opaque gouache brush. I'm going to keep this orange color, and I'm using the preset size, which is 35, the topmost preset size. So at light pressure, that's what this brush looks like. You see a little bit of a brushy edge there. And at heavy pressure, it's quite opaque and it's very flat. So if you want to paint in something with a very flat color inside, very, very plain, no texture inside, but you want a slight texture on the edge, this is the brush that I would use. And when you lift your pencil and lay down more pigment, you're not seeing that overlap. So if you don't want to see overlap, this is the brush to use. The other brushes all have that effect. When you overlap, it looks a little bit like it's actually overlapping. So this one is great for opaque looks, and depending on how much pressure you apply, you can create different looks. So that's that. Now let's move on to the next layer. So let's turn that off and then go to Layerable Gouache and turn that on. And what I'm going to do for this is select a different color. You don't have to, you can continue using this color. I'm just going to go back to blue and something in between, not too light, not too dark. And I am using size 35. Let's tap on the brush. We haven't done that yet. Tap on the brush. Yes. Okay. Now again, zoom in. So with this brush, again, it's all about the pressure. Light pressure. That was not actually very light. That was kind of medium pressure. So light pressure is like this. With light pressure, you get strokes like this. This is a very light pressure. That was medium pressure, but with heavy pressure, do you see the brush is much bigger? So pressure definitely makes a difference. But what this brush, what I use it for, is to create that effect of painting something and then having the brush strokes appear on it every time you add more pigment. Let me show you what I mean. So if I were to create a circle and use medium pressure, do you see this is very, very opaque? There's not much texture going on, but what you can do now is you can increase the brush size a little, actually all the way up, and then lay down more pigment and lift your pencil quickly. So every time you lay down more pigment, what will happen is you will create this sort of look where you can see some of the brush strokes on the layer. So this creates brush strokes that are a little bit different from the brush strokes you would see with other brushes. So let me show you as an example. So remember we had this brush up here, the Brushy wet paint. that also has brush strokes, but they don't look like this. It looks a little bit different, more wet, I would say, and very soft. But this has brush strokes that are more dry and not as soft. So this is really a nice brush where you want to layer more pigment. So I'm going to go back. And when you layer the pigment, you want it to show up with some brush strokes. And what you want to do is you want to apply really light pressure when you do this to create this look. To play around with that and get a feel for how that is, because depending on how you use your pencil, you'll get slightly different brush strokes. So that's the layerable gouache. Now let's go back to the layers panel, turn this off, and then go to flat paint and turn that on. I'm going to continue using this blue color. You can select any color that you want. And we're going to go to flat paint A and B. So these are both flat, but they have slightly different textures. So flat paint A, I'm using the largest preset size. This is something that I would use to block some color in a background. So at light pressure, that's what it looks like. But at heavy pressure, it looks like this. It has some texture on the edges and the center does not have as much texture. And depending on how much pressure you apply, you can create, and you can lift your pencil or lay down more pigment. And this is, I love to use this for backgrounds that need a little bit of texture, painterly texture, but not too much. So that's what flat paint A looks like. At a smaller size, it's slightly different. This is at low pressure. This is at high pressure. You see less of the difference at a smaller size. You see a lot more of the difference at a larger size. And you can use this to create texture on top of an existing shape. So for example, let's say I already have the shape and I want to add some of this texture on top. I can change the hue just a little bit and then maybe add some texture on top like this. So you can create interesting textures with this brush depending on how much pressure you apply and what size you use it at. Now let's go to flat paint B. Similar concept, but it does have a different texture. So I'm going to use, actually let's use the largest preset size, which is 80. So light pressure, hardly see it. Heavy pressure, you see more of it, and there's not only texture on the sides, but also inside. Now I'm going to use this at a smaller size. This is preset size 35, and let's do the same thing we did on the other side, which is to create a rectangle, and I'm lifting my pencil and laying down more pigment, and every time I lift the pencil, I'm getting a little bit of that overlap. So as you can see, this and this look quite different. This is much softer, more delicate looking. This is not as delicate looking. It's got more texture and it does feel a little more dry. So they are both flat brushes, but they do create different textures. So depending on the painting, depending on your illustration, you may pick one over the other. And you can, as I said, layer more pigment on top in a different color to add even more visual interest. I like to do that. So if you want to get really messy, you definitely can. And I would suggest vary the pressure. This is all about the pressure. If you don't vary the pressure and you use the exact same pressure throughout, you will get a very different result. They don't even look like they're the same brush anymore. It's all about varying the pressure. Okay, so now let's go back to the layers panel, turn this off, and then we're going to talk about the soft edge paint. That's the last layer for today, and we will do the rest in the next video. So let's turn on soft edge paint, and these are A, B, and C. So again, similar brushes, slight differences, and let's go here. So I'm going to tap here. As you can see here, you can already see that there are some slight differences. Let's test them out. So I am going to use, let's do a green for this. Not too dark, not too light. And let's test this out together. So I'm going to zoom in and 25. I'm going to use that medium, mid-size preset size. And I think you get the gist. pressure, pressure, pressure. So light pressure, that's what it looks like. Do you see what I mean by soft edge? The edges are soft. It's like an old brush being used, and it's a little dry. Heavy pressure. With heavy pressure, you don't have the texture that we see here, but you still have some texture on the edges. And when you lift your pencil and add more pigment, I think you can hopefully see this, you see a little bit of that layering. If you don't like that, you can always smudge it out. But I added that into all of the brushes in the set because when you do paint with gouache and you let a layer dry and then you add more, you do see a little bit of that overlap. So I wanted to show that with these brushes, that little overlap. Okay, so now let's talk about soft edge B. This is a slightly different texture. I'm using the mid-size again. Light pressure. You hardly see it with light pressure, so this is definitely much more pressure sensitive than the other one. And then heavy pressure, it looks like that. So it's even a softer look than that. And same thing here, when you apply pigment, you lift your pencil and apply more pigment, you will see a very slight overlap. And to get the most out of this brush, I always say, vary the pressure when you're filling in your shapes. So now that has an interesting look. If I didn't vary the pressure, it would look quite flat. And now let's go to soft edge C. Same concept. I'm going to use the 50% size and light pressure. Very different look than this one and this one. Has a dry look, much more dry than these two. And then heavy pressure. And if you lift your pencil and add more pigment, you can definitely layer on the color. And at a larger size, you can lay on pigment and lift your pencil and lay on more. And you can create a variety of textures like that. So those are the soft brushes. This one I feel is the most soft out of these three. I generally like to use this one though. It's all about personal preference and it really depends on what you're painting. If I was painting something that needed that fluffy effect, I would probably use soft edge paint B. If I needed more texture, something like maybe jeans, I might use this one. So depending on what you're painting, choose the right brush that works for you. And that covers today's video. This is part 1. I will be covering the rest of the brushes in the set. So these brushes here, and then also all of these brushes down here in the next video. So I will put that link in the description as well as the pinned comment. If you have any questions, do let me know in the comments below. But if you have any specific questions about a purchase that you have made, email me. That is the best way to reach me. You can find my email address on my website. And thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!